Ahoy! Today we're talking about guard reworks. As we know, there are multiple reworks still coming up this season, and I wanted to talk a little bit about who that could be for and why. Now, the first rework is already confirmed, and that is Bastet. Hi-Rez has stated that they will rework Bastet again because they're not happy with the result of the initial rework. For this one, we actually have some new information in the files now as well. She has a version 3, and this version 3 comes with a passive version 3. As far as I'm aware, the ultimate will also be reworked, but we don't have information about that yet. The passive version 3 currently has Strength Drawn from Pain and Power Devoured as nodes. Now, Strength from Pain is actually Hercules' passive, so it might be that it's just building upon that, or it might be that it is simply describing what the ability does. What this could mean is that her abilities potentially deal higher damage if the target has lower health. Arachne's passive Predator is similar, increasing her basic attack damage when the target has lower health, but Bastet likely wouldn't get something for her basic attacks, so I imagine it might be something for abilities, and maybe this Power Devoured part means that only one ability is amplified and then the extra damage is consumed or similar. That will go hand in hand very nicely with her playstyle, where you're often encouraged to just get in and out very quickly and try to burst a target, or at least get them relatively low, and maybe that'll give you that little bit of extra damage to finish them off. If it's somehow connected to the ultimate as well, and if other abilities will see changes, is something we'll find out at a later point. I would imagine that especially the 3 might get another look as well, considering it kind of only works decently in combination with the current ult, so if they were to remove that ult, they might have to do something about the 3 as well. And that brings us to the other guard that's getting reworked. What I did is going through every role and trying to figure out which guards might have rework potential. And then also trying to figure out why they might or might not be reworked. And then come to the most likely candidates. The first ones here are the Assassins. The first one of them being Arachne. Arachne is obviously a very stumpy goddess that usually doesn't do very well in competitive, but usually does relatively well in ranked, especially until a certain rank. So this is something that I think Hi-Rez doesn't really like in terms of balancing. At the same time, Arachne already had her first rework, and I feel like they're kind of not too bothered by it either, and just look at her in a similar way to Freya, which we'll get to later, where she is just in a place where she doesn't have to be viable everywhere, rather than giving her another rework. She's also decently popular, and that obviously discourages Hi-Rez from reworking her. I know some people actually still want her old kit back, and I think her old kit had some elements that were more interesting than her current kit, but I don't really see that happening. The next one is Awilix. Awilix is, in my opinion, a very interesting goddess with a unique kit, but it's also somewhat dated in some ways because it's so limited to specific matchups and specific counters or non-counters essentially. So performance can very strongly vary based on the amount of knock-ups on your team, the amount of leaps on the enemy team, and how good the enemy players are at understanding her kit and everything. So I think she has potential for a minor rework, maybe the ult specifically, but I don't think she'd be looked at for a full rework either, because I think she wouldn't be the most exciting goddess to rework when there are many parts of her kit that still work very well. Bakasura is also worth mentioning because of his minion dependence, that I think is something that could be looked at for a rework, but I think his kit outside of that doesn't really need a rework, and he's also relatively popular. But there's actually a reason why I think none of these are also likely, and that's because we are getting the rework for Bastet, and we just recently got a rework for Loki. And I would be surprised if Hi-Rez would be hyping up another assassin rework along with that in the same year. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if these guards are being looked at for minor changes, but I don't expect massive ones. It's also obviously worth mentioning that a lot of people still want Raven to be a warrior again, but I find it unlikely that Hi-Rez would do a revert there, and if they did, they would probably not rework the whole kit, but rather just rework his base stats back to being a warrior. When it comes to the Guardians, I actually couldn't find many that have potential for a rework at all. I think most Guardians are pretty decently balanced, they have a relatively flexible kit, and yeah, they work out pretty well. The only one that I could think of, who also recently got a buff, is Kumbhakarna. He always feels like he's in a little bit of a weird spot to the other supports, has a good amount of single target lockdown, but not really the AoE fighting potential or buff potential that some other guards bring. But at the same time, I also don't really think he is bad enough or out of place enough for a rework, but rather some minor ability tweaks. When it comes to hunters, we see a similar picture. Most hunters actually work pretty well in their own right. They're not always all strong, but I don't think they have to be. If there are any guards that would potentially be looked at for a rework, it's probably the immobile hunters here. So maybe a Muzen Cup, Artemis or Skadi. None of these seem likely to me, but generally they don't enjoy as much popularity as their more mobile counterparts in the vast majority of metas. Looking at the warriors, things look relatively similar to the guardians here. Most warriors, I think, work pretty well in various ways. One that stands out a little bit is Chark, who is not always working as well as you'd want him to be, I think, and who has received a ton of buffs, but still usually struggles in most matchups and is usually looked at as the beginner warrior. That is something that could be targeted, but that is something that maybe would still be more targeted through specific buffs to his abilities or his stats rather than a rework. Because I think his kit in itself isn't inherently bad. There's also Mulan, who has been struggling to find her way into the meta, but I think her kit is interesting enough and adjustable enough still for her to come back naturally without needing to have any major reworks for that to be possible. Also, there's Odin, who is always worth mentioning. I don't even know how many times he got changed at this point, but he definitely feels like he's still often in an awkward place compared to other guards in the meta. That said, I don't think he would be targeted for another rework at the moment. I think Hi-Rez is kind of just seeing how he does, since they're still kind of rebalancing him from his last rework. And that brings us to the mages, which in my opinion are the most spicy place to look. This is where I would expect the rework to happen. The first guard that should be mentioned here is Aphrodite. I know a lot of people actually want an Aphrodite rework, but at the same time, I think it's kind of the similar situation to the Loki rework, where you have a large portion of the player base, probably even larger than Loki, that would not want a rework. So the odds of this going well and them not alienating a lot of people in the process are incredibly low. So I would expect that this would not happen. If we were in a vacuum where player opinion didn't matter, then I would not be surprised if we saw an Aphrodite rework though, because I think there is a lot about her kit that kind of could work better for a team-oriented game. We also obviously have Freya, who is still in a very awkward spot, but Hi-Rez already said that in her case, they are okay with her kind of being in an awkward spot and maybe not being the most competitive ready goddess. The problem is that she will essentially always have to be somewhat underpowered in order to not be completely broken, because that's just how her kit works. And resulting from that, she could technically be a candidate for a rework, but I don't think that Hi-Rez wants to touch her for now. There's also Hades, who, even after his role change, never really found his place. He is not ineffective, and especially in ranked he is very effective, but it's still a bit of a weird character that is not really a mid-mage, not really a solo mage most of the time, depending on what level of play we're talking. So it's a bit weird for him, it's a bit hard for him to really settle somewhere. And obviously changing his role again could make that better, could make that worse. But in his case, I also don't know in what direction they could take his kit to fundamentally change this. I think Hades' kit kind of is relatively intertwined, and if you start touching one of the abilities, then you have to start changing a lot. And I'm not sure if that is a good way to even go about him. Or maybe, you know, just look at his defensive stats again or something. There's also Nuwa, who still hinges very strongly on her ultimate and not so much on her base kit. But in her case, I think another rework would also not be what solved this, but rather just tweaks to the ult specifically and then maybe ramping up her other stats a little bit or something. Generally speaking, the healer and carry mages are candidates that I would not rule out, at least because a lot of them feel a little bit awkward in one way or another, but that is partially also a meta thing, so it's hard to say if Hi-Rez would look at one specifically here. But the final three guards we're going to talk about here are the ones that I would consider more likely. The first one is Zeus. Zeus' kit still is kind of awkward in Conquest. And at the same time, Zeus performs very, very well in other game modes. And it's always hard for Hi-Rez to balance around that and make him somewhat reasonably viable across all modes without making him completely broken in some of them. In my personal opinion, especially his 2 is still a janky ability, And his ultimate is also kind of weird because on high levels of play you will not even see the players maxing it, because usually you don't really get much damage out of it, which you would think is something that wouldn't happen with an immobile mage that is just built around damage. I think even after all the changes that Hi-Rez has done to Zeus over the year, they haven't really found the right place for him yet, and it's especially awkward considering he's one of the poster boys of Smite essentially, and he hardly ever feels like he is anything of an impactful god compared to many others. And then there's Nox. Some people seem to be really convinced that Nox will be getting the rework. Now, I do think there is reason for them thinking that. I do think that there is definitely potential in Nox's kit for a rework once again. She already had another rework before that as well. Especially since so much of her combo hinges on landing her 2 and 1, and if that doesn't happen, then her impact shrinks significantly. At the same time, I think a lot of people undervalue how much impact you can still have just using one of these abilities. For example, using the 2 for zoning or to interrupt mobility, and then just using the 1 as follow-up damage afterwards on a different target, and also the setup for your teammates. It's obviously a very natural combo, but I don't think it's necessarily the only way her kit can ever be used. So I wouldn't be surprised if she ends up being the one to be reworked, but I also wouldn't be surprised if she will not be reworked. If she is, I would imagine the rework would be heavily focused on the first 2 abilities, and maybe she would get another passive yet again. And last but not least, we have Apwash. Now, when it comes to Apwash, we actually had some very interesting remarks from Ajax on the most recent patch show, where Apwash got multiple buffs. What he said was that the patch notes would contain hints towards more drastic changes for Apwash in the future at a later point, in the distant future. However, the patch notes don't actually contain any information about this. It only explains why the change happened and what the change is supposed to do, which is increasing his base defensive stats and reducing his ultimate cooldown. But the way that Ajax phrased it made it sound like Apwash could potentially get a rework. And I think he would be a suitable god for it. I think Apwash is someone that has a bit of an awkward kit, not only between his base abilities, but also his passive that kind of contradicts using his 2 aggressively. So I think there's room to make something out of that is a little bit more functional and more meta-fitting as well. The question is, since Ajax specifically talked about the distant future, if this is the rework that we'll be seeing this year, or if maybe Apwash is a rework that is more looked at for next year and there's another god in between. In that case, I'd go back to the ones that I mentioned before. I think those are the likely candidates for it, and we will find out which one it actually is. When we know, I will of course update you here, so if you're new to the channel, click like and subscribe, or I will go to my garage, hide in the corner, stay at my home gym and contemplate if it's harder for me to find the time to work out, or for you to find the... Thanks to my patrons for making this video possible. That's That Nick Walker, Drain Brennan, Lanta25 Green, Zelaria, Zed the Undead, Nevitz Jr., Rawas, Angel, Z Ferroli, and everyone else you see here.